The river Sarai cut through the heart of the jungle like a glistening vein, its waters a source of life and death in equal measure. In the dry season, it was a gentle companion, offering cool relief to the animals and a steady source of fish for the humans who lived in the nearby village. But as the monsoon clouds gathered in the distance, the river began to transform. Its waters, once clear and calm, grew darker, faster, and more volatile, carrying whispers of the chaos to come. The jungle surrounding the river teemed with life. Towering sal trees stood sentinel, their roots buried deep in the soil, while vines and creepers tangled themselves into intricate webs. Birds of every color darted between the branches, their calls echoing through the thick canopy. Herds of deer grazed cautiously near the undergrowth, ever wary of predators. And there, in a clearing not far from the riverbank, stood the great matriarch Shahana, her massive frame both majestic and weathered. Shahana was a leader in every sense of the word. Her wrinkled skin bore the marks of time and battles fought, while her tusks, though slightly chipped, gleamed with strength. She moved with deliberate grace, her wide ears fanning to sense the slightest change in the air. Her herd followed her faithfully, trusting her to guide them through the jungle's many dangers. Yet, despite her strength, a shadow hung over her. Only weeks earlier, Shahana had lost her calf, a playful and curious young elephant, to a crocodile that had lurked in the shallows of the river. The memory of her calf's cries still haunted her, and though she remained stoic, the loss had left a hollow ache in her heart. Across the river, the village bustled with life. Small, mud-walled houses with thatched roofs clustered together, their foundations precariously close to the water's edge. The villagers were a hardy people, accustomed to the jungle's demands and the river's temperament. Men and women worked tirelessly in the fields, their hands rough from years of labor, while children played barefoot in the dirt, their laughter ringing out like music. Among them were Arjun and Mira, a young couple who had built their modest home with care and dreams of a bright future. Their lives revolved around their infant son, Ravi, whose chubby hands and wide, curious eyes brought them endless joy. Ravi was their world, and they were determined to protect him from the hardships of their reality. The villagers respected the jungle, though they feared it too. They knew its rhythms and followed its unspoken rules, keeping a wary eye on the wildlife that occasionally wandered too close to their homes. Elephants, in particular, inspired awe and dread. To some, they were symbols of the gods, revered for their strength and intelligence. To others, they were unpredictable giants, capable of trampling crops and homes in moments of fury. The villagers' relationship with the jungle was a fragile balance of coexistence and caution. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, an oppressive stillness settled over the jungle. The monsoon clouds loomed closer, their edges tinged with an ominous shade of gray. Shahana sensed the change before it came, her instincts sharper than any weather forecast. She trumpeted softly to her herd, signaling them to move toward higher ground. Her movements were unhurried, but her urgency was clear. The jungle animals, too, began to react. Monkeys screeched and leaped between the trees, while birds took flight, their wings cutting through the thick air. In the village, the elders gathered to discuss the coming storm. The rains, they knew, were both a blessing and a curse. They nourished the crops and filled the wells, but they also swelled the river beyond its banks, turning it into a raging monster. Arjun and Mira listened anxiously, their hands gripping each other tightly as they cradled Ravi. Their home, perched dangerously close to the water, would be among the first to face the flood's wrath. Still, they held on to hope that the storm would pass with minimal damage, as it often had in years past. The first drops of rain fell as a gentle patter, almost soothing in their rhythm. But within hours, the skies opened in earnest, unleashing sheets of water that pounded the earth relentlessly. The river swelled with alarming speed, its once gentle currents turning into ferocious waves that devoured everything in their path. Villagers scrambled to secure their belongings and lead their livestock to safety, their voices rising in panic against the roar of the storm. Arjun and Mira worked frantically to reinforce their home, but the floodwaters showed no mercy. When the river finally breached its banks, it came with a force that swept away trees, homes, and hope. On the other side of the river, Shahana watched the chaos unfold. Her herd, huddled close together, looked to her for guidance. The matriarch stood tall, her ears twitching as she assessed the situation. The flood was unlike any she had seen before, and her instincts screamed at her to move her family farther inland. Yet, as she prepared to lead her herd to safety, a sound cut through the cacophony of the storm, a faint, desperate cry carried on the wind. Shahana paused, her trunk raised in the air, listening intently. The cry came again, unmistakably the wail of a baby. Something stirred within her, a pang that struck the hollow space left by her own calves' loss. The jungle around her seemed to fade as Shahana made her decision. Without hesitation, she turned toward the river, her massive body cutting through the deluge as she moved closer to the sound. Her herd trumpeted in confusion, but she did not stop. In that moment, the jungle, the river, and the storm all seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would unfold. The story of Shahana's extraordinary act was about to begin, though neither she nor the humans across the river could yet imagine how it would change their lives forever. The monsoon rains poured relentlessly, turning the river Sarai into a churning, roaring beast. What had been a placid, life-giving current only days before was now an unstoppable torrent of destruction. The village, nestled precariously close to the riverbank, began to feel the full wrath of the storm. The water levels rose with an alarming speed, carrying with them debris from the jungle, branches, leaves, even entire uprooted trees. Inside their modest hut, Arjun and Mira worked frantically to prepare for the worst. The rain pounded against the roof, the sound almost deafening, while the wind howled like an angry spirit. Mira held baby Ravi close, her arms trembling as she tried to soothe his cries. Arjun secured what he could, their few possessions, tools, and a sack of rice they had managed to keep dry. The river had always been their lifeline, but tonight it had turned against them. Outside, the villagers shouted to one another over the roar of the rain. Some were already fleeing to higher ground, carrying bundles of belongings on their backs. Others struggled to round up livestock, their cattle and goats terrified by the storm. The village elder, an old man with a deep, commanding voice, urged everyone to move quickly. "The river won't wait for us," he cried. "Leave what you can't carry." But for Arjun and Mira, leaving wasn't so simple. Their home, though humble, was all they had. Arjun tried to reassure Mira as he tied the door shut with a frayed rope. "It's just precaution," he said, though his voice betrayed his fear. "The river hasn't reached us yet." Mira didn't respond. Her focus was on Ravi, whose wails grew louder with every gust of wind. She kissed his damp forehead, whispering prayers under her breath. The baby's cries mixed with the cacophony outside, creating an almost surreal sense of unreality. For a moment, it was as if the storm had consumed the world, leaving nothing but chaos in its wake. Meanwhile, across the river, Shahana stood vigilant. The elephant matriarch had led her herd to a ridge that overlooked the jungle, a place she knew to be safe from the rising waters. Her sharp instincts told her this flood was no ordinary event. The rain fell in sheets, soaking her thick skin, but she didn't flinch. Her ears swiveled, attuned to every sound, while her trunk raised to test the air. Something was wrong, and it gnawed at her. The cries of her herd members, especially the younger ones, pulled at her heart. The calves huddled close to their mothers, their small trunks clinging to whatever comfort they could find. Shahana rumbled softly, a sound of reassurance, as she surveyed the landscape below. The jungle was rapidly transforming into a swamp, and the once familiar river now seemed like an alien force, claiming everything in its path. It was then that she heard it, a faint, high-pitched cry that cut through the storm. It was not the cry of an elephant calf. It was something else, something human, Shahana froze, her ears flicking toward the sound. It came again, clearer this time. A baby's wail, distant but unmistakable, carried on the wind like a ghostly plea for help. She turned her massive head toward the source, her sharp eyes scanning the murky water below. In the village, the river's rage finally broke through the flimsy barriers of sandbags the villagers had hastily constructed. The floodwaters surged into the lower huts, sweeping away everything in their path. Arjun and Mira's home, precariously close to the riverbank, shuddered as the waters struck. The rope holding their door snapped, and the wooden structure groaned under the pressure. "Arjun!" Mira screamed as a flood burst through their door, the icy water rushing in like an uninvited guest. Arjun grabbed Ravi from her arms, holding the baby high above his head as the water rose to their knees, then their waists. "We have to get out," Arjun shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. He pushed Mira toward the door, but before they could step outside, a powerful wave slammed into their home. The force knocked them off their feet, and Ravi slipped from Arjun's grasp. "No!" Mira screamed, lunging for her son, but the current was too strong. Ravi was swept through the broken door and into the dark, swirling waters outside. Arjun and Mira clawed their way out of the collapsing hut, their cries of desperation lost in the storm. They ran along the edge of the flood, shouting Ravi's name, but the baby was nowhere to be seen. Mira collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, while Arjun continued his frantic search, his body trembling from both the cold and the sheer terror of losing his child. Ravi's cries, though faint, reached Shahana once more. Something inside her stirred, a deep, instinctual pull that she couldn't ignore. The loss of her own calf had left a void in her, but this cry awakened something dormant, something powerful. Without hesitation, she stepped away from her herd and lumbered toward the water. Her herd trumpeted in confusion and alarm. The young bull, who had been trying to assert his leadership, called out to her, urging her to return. But Shahana didn't stop. She waded into the water, her massive feet sinking into the muddy ground, her trunk raised high. The river's current tugged at her, but she pressed on, her body a fortress against the raging flood. The baby's cries grew louder as she approached. Ravi, clinging to a piece of driftwood, bobbed helplessly in the water, his tiny face pale with fear. Shahana reached him just as the current threatened to pull him under. With the gentlest touch, she wrapped her trunk around the infant, lifting him out of the water. Ravi's cries quieted, replaced by the sound of his labored breathing. For a moment, the storm seemed to pause, as if even nature itself was in awe of what had just happened. Shahana turned and made her way back to the shore, her movements steady and deliberate despite the river's attempts to drag her down. On the bank, she placed Ravi on a patch of dry ground, her trunk lingering for a moment as if to ensure he was safe. The baby looked up at her, his wide, tear-filled eyes meeting hers. It was a moment of connection, a bridge between two worlds that rarely intersected. Across the river, Arjun and Mira continued their frantic search, unaware that their child had been saved. And Shahana, standing tall against the storm, trumpeted into the night, a call that would carry far and wide, signaling that hope was not yet lost. The storm finally began to abate as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. The rain, though still steady, had softened, and the river's fury seemed to slow, though its swollen waters still surged dangerously. The jungle was eerily quiet, its usual chorus of bird calls and animal cries silenced in the aftermath of the flood. Amid the devastation, the villagers stumbled through the mud and debris, calling out to loved ones, searching for survivors, and salvaging what little they could. Arjun and Mira trudged along the riverbank, their clothes soaked and clinging to their skin. Mira's face was pale, her eyes swollen and red from crying, while Arjun's expression was a mask of grim determination. They called Ravi's name over and over, their voices hoarse and desperate. Mira clutched at Arjun's arm, leaning on him for support as her strength waned. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of fear and grief pressing down on them like the storm clouds above. Ravi! Mira's voice cracked as she cried out again, her hope dwindling with each passing second. The river seemed endless, its surface a mirror of chaos, littered with branches, broken pieces of huts, and other detritus from the flood. Somewhere in that turmoil, their son was lost, and the thought was unbearable. As they rounded a bend in the riverbank, a sight stopped them in their tracks. In the distance, standing tall against the gray backdrop of the jungle, was an elephant, a massive, majestic creature. At first, they thought it was just another wild animal displaced by the flood. But as they stepped closer, their eyes widened in disbelief. The elephant was standing protectively over a small, bundled figure on the ground. "Arjun!" Mira gasped, her voice trembling. "Is that?" "It can't be," Arjun whispered, but his feet were already moving, carrying him closer to the scene. Mira followed, her heart pounding in her chest. As they approached, the details became clear. It was Ravi. Their son lay nestled in a dry patch of earth, his tiny body trembling but alive. His eyes fluttered open as they drew near, and a weak, hoarse cry escaped his lips. Mira fell to her knees beside him, tears streaming down her face as she scooped him into her arms. She cradled him tightly, her sobs of relief mingling with his cries. "Ravi, my baby, you're alive," she whispered, kissing his damp forehead over and over. Arjun knelt beside her, his hands shaking as he touched his son's face, his own tears spilling freely. "Thank you, gods," he murmured, though his eyes remained fixed on the elephant who had saved their child. Shahana stood silently, watching the reunion unfold. Her large ears flapped gently, and her trunk swayed in the air as if she were studying the humans. Despite her towering size, there was no menace in her posture. Instead, she seemed calm, almost maternal, as though ensuring the baby she had saved was truly safe. For a moment, there was a profound stillness, a shared understanding that transcended language or species. Arjun, still clutching Ravi's tiny hand, looked up at Shahana. "She saved him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This elephant, she saved our son." Mira turned to look at the great creature, her tear-streaked face filled with gratitude and awe. "Why?" she whispered, as if speaking directly to Shahana. Why would she do this? Shahana made no sound but shifted slightly, her trunk lowering to the ground. To Arjun and Mira, it was almost as though the elephant understood their words. She gazed at them with her dark, intelligent eyes, filled with a depth that neither of them could comprehend. Ravi, still cradled in Mira's arms, reached out his small hand toward the elephant. His fingers brushed against Shahana's trunk, and the matriarch responded with a gentle touch, her trunk curling briefly around his hand before retreating. The villagers, drawn by the commotion, began to gather nearby. Their expressions ranged from astonishment to fear. Some murmured prayers, seeing the scene as a divine sign. "An elephant saved a human child," one elder said, shaking his head in disbelief. "This must be a blessing from the gods." Others were more skeptical, their fear of the wild creature outweighing their awe. "What if it turns on us?" Another villager muttered. "Elephants aren't tame. They're unpredictable." Arjun rose to his feet, still holding Ravi protectively, and turned to face the crowd. "This elephant saved our son," he said firmly. "She didn't harm him. She didn't harm any of us. We owe her a debt we can never repay." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. It was difficult to reconcile their fear of the jungle's dangers with the miraculous sight before them. The elephant, far from acting aggressively, stood calmly, her presence almost regal. But the unspoken tension in the crowd lingered. "She should leave," one of the elders said finally, his voice carrying authority. "Wild animals don't belong here. It's dangerous for her to stay." "No," Mira said suddenly, her voice stronger than before. She stood with Ravi still in her arms, her eyes blazing with defiance. "She saved my son. If she hadn't been here, Ravi would be gone. How can we turn her away after what she's done?" The elder hesitated, but before he could reply, Shahana moved. Slowly and deliberately, she turned away from the humans and began to walk toward the edge of the jungle. The crowd parted to let her pass, their fear palpable, though Shahana showed no signs of hostility. She paused once, looking back at the family she had saved. Her gaze lingered on Ravi, who reached out his small hand again, a soft sound escaping his lips. Then she was gone, disappearing into the trees as silently as she had appeared. The villagers stood in stunned silence for a long moment. Finally, Arjun broke it, his voice quiet but resolute. "We should be grateful," he said. "This elephant didn't have to save Ravi, but she did. That means something." Mira nodded, holding Ravi close. She felt a strange connection to the elephant, one she couldn't explain. "It does mean something," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. The villagers dispersed slowly, murmuring among themselves about what they had witnessed. Some were still uneasy, but others, like Arjun and Mira, couldn't shake the feeling that they had been part of something extraordinary. As they walked back to what was left of their home, Mira looked at Ravi, now dozing peacefully in her arms. "Do you think we'll see her again?" she asked Arjun. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But if we do, we'll know her. And I think she'll know us too." In the distance, deep within the jungle, Shahana trumpeted softly, her call echoing through the still damp trees. It was a sound of reassurance, of closure, and perhaps of a bond that had only just begun. In the days following the flood, the village began its slow process of recovery. Homes were rebuilt, livestock was rounded up, and the riverbank was fortified with new sandbags. The scars of the storm were visible everywhere: mud-streaked walls, uprooted trees, and the haunted eyes of villagers who had lost loved ones. Yet amidst the devastation, a sense of wonder lingered in the air, sparked by the incredible tale of the elephant who had saved baby Ravi. Shahana, the matriarch, had not gone far. She lingered near the edge of the jungle, close enough to keep a watchful eye on the village, but far enough to avoid alarming the people. Her herd had rejoined her, but the young bull, eager to assert his dominance, was unsettled by her behavior. Shahana's decision to remain near the humans was unconventional, and the bull saw it as a challenge to his emerging authority. He trumpeted his frustration often, circling her, but Shahana stood firm, her silent resolve unshaken. In the village, Shahana's presence became a topic of heated debate. Arjun and Mira, still overwhelmed with gratitude, took it upon themselves to feed the elephant, offering her bananas and handfuls of rice. Shahana accepted these gifts with grace, her trunk moving delicately to take the food. Ravi, ever curious and unafraid, would laugh and clap whenever Shahana appeared, reaching his tiny hands toward her. The bond between the baby and the elephant deepened with each passing day, and it was clear to anyone who watched that Shahana saw herself as his protector. However, not everyone in the village shared Arjun and Mira's admiration for the elephant. The elders convened a meeting in the temple courtyard, their faces etched with concern. "This is a wild animal," one elder said, his voice stern. "We cannot forget that. She may seem calm now, but what happens if she becomes aggressive? She could destroy our homes or harm our children." "She's already saved a child," Arjuna argued, his voice firm. "She didn't harm Ravi. She saved him. We owe her a debt of kindness." "But for how long?" another elder countered. "What if her herd decides to follow her here? A whole group of elephants near the village would be disastrous for our crops and for our lives." The debate raged on, dividing the villagers. Some, inspired by Shahana's act of heroism, supported Arjun and Mira, believing the elephant was a sign of the god's favor. Others, wary of the dangers wild animals posed, insisted that Shahana be driven away. The tension simmered, an invisible fault line running through the heart of the community. Meanwhile, deeper in the jungle, the poachers had heard rumors of the lone elephant near the village. To them, Shahana was not a hero but a prize. Her size, her tusks, and her unusual behavior made her a valuable target. They began to track her movements, their plans sinister and methodical. They knew patience was key, waiting for the right moment to strike. Unaware of the looming danger, Arjun, Mira, and Ravi continued to visit Shahana daily. Arjun noticed that Shahana seemed to sense their approach long before they reached her, her trunk raised to catch their scent. Mira often sat nearby, letting Ravi play under her watchful eye while Shahana stood guard, her massive frame a comforting presence. The connection between the family and the elephant grew stronger, a fragile thread woven from trust and gratitude. One day, as the family approached, they found Shahana not alone. Her herd had followed her to the outskirts of the jungle, and the sight was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. The young bull, standing at the head of the group, trumpeted loudly, his body language aggressive. He stomped the ground and flared his ears, clearly displeased with Shahana's interactions with the humans. The rest of the herd watched cautiously, their movements hesitant but curious. Arjun instinctively pulled Mira and Ravi back, shielding them behind him. Shahana, however, stepped forward, her presence commanding. She let out a low rumble, a sound of reassurance directed both at her herd and the humans. The young bull hesitated, his aggression faltering under her steady gaze. Shahana trumpeted softly, her tone firm yet calm, and the herd began to relax, their tension dissipating like mist in the morning sun. Over the next few days, the herd lingered near the village, their dynamics shifting as they observed Shahana's interactions with the humans. The younger elephants, emboldened by her example, ventured closer, their trunks reaching out to investigate the strange beings who offered food and gentle words. The villagers watched these encounters with a mixture of awe and apprehension, unsure of what to make of this unusual harmony. But the fault line in the village began to widen. The elders, alarmed by the presence of the entire herd, demanded immediate action. "This cannot continue," one elder declared during a meeting. "We've already seen what a single flood can do. Imagine the damage a herd of elephants could cause if they decide to charge through our fields." Arjun stood up, his voice steady but passionate. "We have a chance to do something different," he said, "to live alongside these animals instead of fearing them. Shahana has shown us that it's possible." "Possible?" the elder scoffed. "Or foolish? You're gambling with the safety of this village." The villagers were split. Some sided with Arjun, inspired by his words and Shahana's gentle demeanor. Others sided with the elders, driven by fear and the memory of past conflicts with wildlife. The tension was palpable, a storm brewing beneath the surface. Amidst this conflict, the poachers made their move. One night, under the cover of darkness, they crept toward the edge of the jungle, their movements silent and deliberate. They carried ropes, tranquilizers, and weapons, their intent clear. Shahana, standing watch near the village, sensed their approach before they came into view. Her ears twitched, and her trunk swung in the air, catching the faint scent of danger. She let out a warning trumpet, loud and piercing, that echoed through the jungle and the village. The herd responded instantly, their bodies moving in unison to form a protective circle. The villagers, awakened by the noise, stumbled out of their homes, confused and frightened. "What's happening?" Mira asked, clutching Ravi tightly. Arjun's eyes darted toward the jungle. "Something's wrong," he said. "Stay here. I'm going to see." Before he could take a step, the poachers emerged from the shadows, their torches casting flickering light on the scene. The sight of the armed men froze everyone in place, the weight of their intent heavy in the air. Shahana moved first, her massive body charged forward, her trumpets a deafening battle cry. The herd followed, their sheer size and power a force to be reckoned with. The poachers faltered, but they didn't retreat. One of them fired a tranquilizer dart, the projectile striking Shahana in the shoulder. She stumbled but didn't stop, her determination unyielding. The villagers, galvanized by Shahana's bravery, began to act. Arjun rallied the men, grabbing torches and sticks to drive the poachers back. The young bull, once hesitant in his leadership, charged with ferocity, his tusks gleaming in the firelight. Together, humans and elephants fought as one, their shared purpose overriding their differences. By the time the poachers fled, leaving behind their equipment and plans, the village was in disarray. Fires burned in the fields, and the air was thick with smoke. Shahana, though injured, stood tall, her body shielding Ravi and Mira, who had taken refuge behind her. The villagers stared at her in awe, their fear replaced by respect. In the aftermath, the lines between humans and elephants blurred. The villagers tended to Shahana's wounds, their hands gentle as they worked. The herd remained nearby, their trust in the humans growing. And for the first time, the village saw the elephants not as threats but as allies, their bond forged in the fires of conflict. But even as harmony began to take root, the question lingered, could it last? The village settled into an uneasy quiet after the tension with Shahana's herd seemed to subside. Shahana's presence and the bond she had formed with Arjun, Mira, and Ravi were remarkable, but the undercurrent of fear and mistrust still lingered. The villagers were trying to adapt to the unusual harmony that had emerged between them and the elephants, but not everyone was convinced it would last. In the dense shadows of the jungle, however, a far greater threat was brewing, one that neither the villagers nor the elephants could have anticipated. The poachers, having tracked Shahana's movements for days, were ready to strike. They saw her as an invaluable target, a majestic matriarch with large tusks and unusual behavior that made her easier to locate. They had observed her interactions with the humans and noticed her reluctance to stray far from the village. To them, this attachment made her vulnerable. With a plan carefully laid, they decided to attack at night, when the village was at its most defenseless. The night of the attack was moonless, the sky a blanket of darkness. The jungle, usually alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, was unervingly quiet. The poachers moved through the undergrowth like shadows, their torches extinguished to avoid detection. They carried an arsenal of ropes, nets, and tranquilizer darts, along with rifles in case their operation turned violent. Shahana, ever watchful, sensed the disturbance before the poachers reached the outskirts of the village. Her large ears twitched, and her trunk lifted to sniff the air. A low rumble emanated from her chest, a warning call that carried through the still night. The herd responded immediately, forming a protective circle around the younger elephants. The young bull, now more confident in his role, stepped forward, his body tense and ready to defend his family. The first sign of the poachers' presence came in the form of smoke. They had set small fires along the perimeter of the village, hoping to create chaos and confusion. The flames flickered in the distance, their light casting eerie shadows on the jungle foliage. The villagers, roused from their sleep, stumbled out of their homes, alarmed and disoriented. "What's happening?" Mira asked, clutching Ravi tightly to her chest. "It's an attack," Arjun said grimly, grabbing a torch from their doorstep. "Stay here. Keep Ravi safe." Shahana's warning trumpet split the air, loud and piercing. The poachers had reached the herd. Their strategy was to isolate Shahana, believing her to be the leader, and use tranquilizers to subdue her. They moved quickly, throwing nets over the elephants and firing darts into the darkness. Shahana roared in defiance, her massive body thrashing against the nets. The herd erupted in chaos, their trumpets echoing like a battle cry. Arjun ran toward the commotion, joining a group of villagers who had armed themselves with sticks and farming tools. "We have to help them," he shouted. Though some villagers hesitated, their fear of the elephants still strong, others followed his lead, realizing that the poachers posed a threat to them as well. The first clash between the poachers and the villagers was brutal. The poachers, better equipped and prepared, used their rifles to intimidate the villagers, firing warning shots into the air. The sound terrified the younger elephants, who screamed and tried to flee, only to be corralled by the nets. Shahana, despite being struck by multiple tranquilizer darts, continued to fight. She swung her trunk with incredible force, knocking 2 poachers off their feet. Her tusks, though dulled by age, were still a formidable weapon, and she used them to tear through the nets that bound her. The young bull charged forward, his tusks gleaming in the firelight. His rage was palpable as he rammed into the poachers' vehicles, overturning them with ease. The poachers, realizing that the elephants were far more aggressive and organized than they had anticipated, began to retreat, but not before firing another round of tranquilizers. One dart struck Shahana square in the shoulder, and she stumbled, her movements slowing. Arjun reached her side just as she began to falter. "Shahana!" he shouted, his voice breaking. He turned to the villagers behind him. "We can't let them take her. She's the reason Ravi is alive." The villagers rallied, their fear replaced by determination. Together, they advanced on the poachers, waving their torches and shouting to drive them back. The poachers, now outnumbered and overwhelmed, began to retreat into the jungle, but their escape was not without cost. One poacher, in a final act of defiance, raised his rifle and aimed it at Shahana. Arjun saw the movement out of the corner of his eye. Without thinking, he lunged forward, putting himself between the rifle and the elephant. The shot rang out, and Arjun fell to the ground, clutching his side. Mira, who had been watching from the edge of the scene, screamed and ran toward him, Ravi still in her arms. Shahana, despite her injuries and the tranquilizers dulling her senses, let out a ferocious roar. Her body surged with one last burst of energy as she charged the poacher, who dropped his rifle and fled in terror. The remaining poachers followed, disappearing into the jungle's depths. The battle was over, but the aftermath was devastating. The fire set by the poachers had spread to the edge of the fields, threatening the crops. Several villagers were injured, and one of the younger elephants had collapsed, its body tangled in a net. Shahana, her strength fading, sank to her knees, her massive frame trembling. Mira knelt beside Arjun, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her hands against his wound. "Stay with me," she begged. "Don't leave us." "I'm fine," Arjun said weakly, though his face was pale. His eyes turned to Shahana, who was struggling to stay upright. She saved us." The villagers worked together to free the trapped elephants and extinguish the fires. They used buckets of water from the river and shovels to beat back the flames. The young bull, now fully embracing his role as a leader, stayed close to the herd, his presence steadying the younger elephants. Shahana, though gravely injured, refused to leave until her herd was safe. By dawn, the fires were extinguished and the poachers were long gone. The village was in ruins, but the bond between the humans and the elephants had been cemented in the crucible of conflict. The villagers gathered around Shahana, their faces filled with a mixture of awe and sorrow. "We owe her our lives," one villager said quietly. "Without her, the poachers would have taken everything." Arjun, now bandaged but still weak, approached Shahana with Mira and Ravi by his side. Ravi reached out toward the elephant, his tiny fingers brushing against her trunk. Shahana rumbled softly, her eyes closing as if in relief. It was a moment of profound connection, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. The villagers, inspired by Shahana's courage and the unity they had found in the face of danger, vowed to protect the jungle and its inhabitants. They knew the poachers would likely return, but they also knew they were stronger together, with the elephants as their allies. As the sun rose over the jungle, painting the sky in hues of gold and orange, Shahana stood once more. She was battered and weary, but her spirit remained unbroken. She trumpeted loudly, her call echoing across the village and the jungle, a declaration of survival and strength. The village was quiet in the aftermath of the battle. Smoke still lingered in the air, curling upward from the charred edges of the fields where the poachers' fires had burned. The villagers moved slowly, their bodies aching and their minds heavy with the events of the night. Yet despite the destruction, there was an unspoken resilience in the air. a shared understanding that they had endured something extraordinary and survived because of their unity with the elephants. Shahana, the great matriarch, rested at the edge of the village. Her body bore the marks of the fight. Deep scratches, bruises, and the dull ache of tranquilizer darts still embedded in her thick skin. Her movements were slow and deliberate, each step a testament to her enduring strength. Yet there was a weariness about her, as though the weight of the night had drained her spirit. The villagers gathered to tend to her wounds. It was a sight none of them could have imagined before this night. Humans working side by side to help a wild elephant. Arjun, despite his injuries, was among them, his face pale but determined. Mira had tried to stop him, urging him to rest, but he had refused. "She saved our lives," he had said simply. "We owe her everything." Using buckets of water from the river, they carefully cleaned the dirt and blood from Shahana's injuries. One of the older women in the village, known for her knowledge of herbal remedies, mixed a poultice from crushed leaves and roots. "This should ease her pain," she said, her voice soft as she gently applied the mixture to Shahana's wounds. The elephant rumbled softly, her dark eyes watching the humans with an expression that seemed almost grateful. Mira stood nearby, cradling Ravi in her arms. The baby, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, giggled and reached out toward Shahana. Mira smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with tears. "He doesn't know how lucky he is," she murmured. "He doesn't know what she's done for him." Arjun, kneeling beside Shahana, glanced up at Mira. "One day he will," he said. "We'll make sure of it." The villagers worked late into the day, not only tending to Shahana, but also helping the other elephants in her herd. The young bull, who had shown incredible bravery during the attack, stood guard over the younger elephants, his eyes watchful and alert. Though the herd had initially been wary of the humans, the night's events had created a fragile trust. The elephants allowed the villagers to approach, their movements cautious but unthreatening. As the sun began to set, casting the jungle in hues of gold and amber, the villagers gathered in the central courtyard for an impromptu meeting. The elders, who had once been the most vocal opponents of Shahana's presence, now spoke with reverence. "This elephant," said the eldest among them, his voice thick with emotion, "has shown us something we didn't think possible. She fought for us, for her family, and for this village. She's not just a wild animal. She's part of something bigger, something we should respect." The others nodded in agreement. Even those who had been skeptical of Shahana's presence were now humbled by her courage. One of the younger men, who had been injured while helping to fight off the poachers, spoke up. "We need to protect them," he said, gesturing toward the herd. "If we don't, the poachers will come back. They'll destroy everything." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The villagers, who had once feared the jungle and its creatures, were now beginning to see the elephants as allies, not enemies. They decided to take action, resolving to patrol the outskirts of the jungle and establish watch groups to deter future poachers. They also pledged to rebuild their fields in a way that would minimize conflict with the elephants, planting crops farther from the jungle's edge and leaving a buffer zone for the animals to roam freely. As the villagers made their plans, Shahana remained by the river, her gaze fixed on the water. She seemed deep in thought, her massive body still, but her ears twitching at the faint sounds of the jungle. Mira approached her cautiously, Ravi still in her arms. She sat down a few feet away, watching the elephant in silence for a moment before speaking. "You've done so much for us," Mira said softly. I don't know if you can understand me, but thank you. You saved my son. You saved all of us." Shahana turned her head slightly, her dark eyes meeting Mira's. For a moment, it felt as though the elephant understood every word. She extended her trunk slowly, and Mira held her breath as it came closer. Then, with surprising gentleness, Shahana brushed her trunk against Ravi's hand. The baby squealed with delight, his laughter breaking the stillness of the evening. Arjun, watching from a distance, smiled faintly. "She knows," he said quietly to one of the other villagers. She knows what she's done. The next few days were a time of healing for both the village and the herd. The villagers worked tirelessly to repair their homes and fields, while the elephants lingered near the outskirts of the jungle, their presence both comforting and protective. Shahana, though still recovering from her injuries, began to regain her strength. The villagers often saw her watching over Ravi and Mira from a distance, her silent vigilance a reminder of the bond they now shared. The young bull, once hesitant in his role as a leader, had grown into his position with confidence. He stayed close to Shahana, learning from her quiet wisdom and following her lead. The other elephants, too, seemed to take their cues from her, moving in harmony with the rhythms of the village and the jungle. One evening, as the sky turned shades of violet and gold, the villagers gathered to honor Shahana and her herd. They lit small lamps and placed them along the riverbank, their flickering light reflecting in the water. Arjun stood at the center of the gathering, holding Ravi in his arms. Mira stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "This elephant," Arjun said, his voice steady, "has shown us that we can live alongside the jungle, that we don't have to fear it. Shahana saved our son, but she also taught us something even greater. She taught us the power of trust." The villagers nodded, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the lamps. For the first time, they saw the jungle not as an enemy but as a part of their lives, something to protect, not fight against. As the night wore on, Shahana and her herd began to move. Slowly and deliberately, they made their way back into the jungle, their silhouettes blending with the shadows of the trees. Shahana paused at the edge of the clearing, turning back to look at the village one last time. She let out a low rumble, a sound of farewell and reassurance, before disappearing into the darkness. The villagers watched in silence, their hearts heavy yet full. They knew that Shahana would not be far, that her presence would always be a part of their lives. And as the last of the lamps flickered out, they felt a newfound sense of hope, a belief that harmony between humans and nature was not just possible, but necessary. The morning of Shahana's departure dawned bright and clear, the air carrying a cool crispness that seemed to cleanse the lingering tension from the village. The floodwaters had receded, leaving behind a landscape of renewed growth. Trees near the river sparkled with droplets of dew, and the once muddy paths through the village were firming again under the sun's warmth. Yet, the beauty of the day was tinged with a quiet sadness, for the villagers knew it was time for Shahana and her herd to return fully to the jungle. Shahana, the great matriarch, stood at the edge of the village, her injuries largely healed but her body still marked by the battles she had endured. Her calm, steady presence had become a fixture in the lives of the villagers, particularly for Arjun, Mira, and little Ravi. Over the past weeks, the family had spent every available moment near her, their bond with the elephant deepening in ways that felt both extraordinary and natural. But now, as Shahana's herd prepared to move deeper into the jungle, that bond faced an inevitable parting. Mira cradled Ravi in her arms as they approached Shahana one last time. The baby, who had grown accustomed to the elephant's towering presence, reached out toward her, babbling happily. "Look at him," Mira whispered to Arjun, her voice thick with emotion. "He doesn't even understand she's leaving." Arjun placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He'll remember her," he said softly. "And so will we." The villagers gathered nearby, their faces a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Over the weeks, Shahana had become more than just an elephant to them. She was a symbol of hope, a reminder that the boundaries between humans and nature weren't as rigid as they had once believed. Even the elders, who had once opposed her presence, stood silently, their earlier fears replaced by a deep respect for the animal who had risked so much to protect them. One of the elders stepped forward, holding a garland of fresh marigolds. He approached Shahana cautiously, unsure if she would allow him to come so close. Shahana, ever watchful, extended her trunk, sniffing the flowers before gently accepting the garland. The elder bowed his head, his voice trembling as he spoke. "You are more than an elephant," he said. "You are our protector, We owe you a debt we can never repay. Shahana let out a soft rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground. The villagers watched in silence as she lifted her trunk, the garland swaying lightly as she placed it over her tusks. The gesture was simple yet profound, a moment of shared understanding between species. Mira stepped forward, holding Ravi out toward Shahana. The baby giggled, reaching for her trunk. Shahana lowered her head, her massive form seeming almost delicate as she gently brushed Ravi's hand with the tip of her trunk. The baby's laughter rang out, a sound so pure and joyful that it brought tears to Mira's eyes. "I don't know if you can understand me," Mira said, her voice breaking, "but thank you. Thank you for everything, for saving him, for saving all of us." Shahana's gaze lingered on Mira for a long moment, her dark eyes filled with an intelligence that seemed to transcend the boundaries between humans and animals. Then, as if understanding the finality of the moment, she stepped back, her trunk curling briefly in the air before she turned toward the jungle. The young bull, now a confident leader, trumpeted softly, signaling to the rest of the herd. One by one, the elephants began to move, their massive bodies blending into the dense greenery. Shahana paused at the edge of the trees, turning back one last time. She looked at the villagers, at Arjun and Mira, and at Ravi, as though committing their faces to memory. "She's saying goodbye," Arjun murmured, his hand tightening on Mira's shoulder. "I hope she knows we'll never forget her," Mira whispered. As Shahana disappeared into the jungle, the villagers stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the spot where she had vanished. It was Arjun who finally broke the stillness. "We need to honor her," he said, his voice firm. "Not just with words, but with action. We need to protect the jungle, the way she protected us." The villagers nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling through the crowd. Inspired by Shahana's bravery, they began to make plans. They agreed to patrol the outskirts of the jungle to deter future poachers and to work with nearby villages to establish a safe zone where elephants could roam freely without fear of harm. They also pledged to leave offerings of food near the forest edge, a gesture of gratitude and respect for Shahana and her herd. In the days that followed, the village transformed. The once fragile bond between humans and the jungle began to solidify as the villagers embraced their role as stewards of the land. Arjun and Mira planted a small grove of mango trees near the riverbank, dedicating it to Shahana. They hoped it would serve as both a sanctuary for the elephants and a reminder of the connection they now shared. Ravi, too young to fully understand, often wandered to the grove with his parents, babbling happily as he played beneath the trees. Mira watched him with a mixture of pride and sadness, her thoughts often drifting to Shahana. "Do you think she'll come back?" she asked Arjun one evening as they sat by the river, watching the sunset. "I don't know," Arjun admitted, "but if she does, we'll be ready to welcome her." Months passed, and life in the village gradually returned to normal. But Shahana's presence lingered, not just in the memories of those she had saved, but in the changes she had inspired. The villagers worked tirelessly to preserve the jungle, their newfound respect for the elephants shaping every decision they made. And though Shahana and her herd were rarely seen, their occasional trumpets in the distance were a comfort, a reminder that they were still there. One morning, as the village stirred to life, Ravi toddled toward the edge of the grove, his tiny feet kicking up clouds of dust. Mira called after him, but he didn't stop. Instead, he pointed toward the jungle, his face lighting up with excitement. "Ma!" he called, his voice high and clear. "Look!" Mira and Arjun hurried to his side, their eyes widening as they followed his gaze. There, standing just beyond the trees, was Shahana. She was older now, her tusks worn and her body marked by the passage of time, but her presence was unmistakable. Behind her, the rest of the herd waited, their movements calm and unthreatening. Shahana lifted her trunk, letting out a low, rumbling call that echoed across the grove. Ravi clapped his hands, laughing as he reached out toward her. Mira knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, she came back. Arjun placed a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes glistening. "She remembers us," he said. Shahana didn't linger. After a moment, she turned and led her herd back into the jungle. But her brief visit was enough to reaffirm the bond between the village and the elephants, a bond that would endure for generations. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting warm light over the village, Mira and Arjun stood together, watching the jungle with a renewed sense of hope. They knew Shahana's story would live on, not just in their memories, but in the legacy of compassion and coexistence she had left behind. The years that followed Shahana's departure were transformative for the village and its people. What had begun as a chance encounter during a devastating flood blossomed into a profound relationship between the villagers and the jungle that surrounded them. Shahana's courage and selflessness left an indelible mark, inspiring a shift in attitudes and priorities that reshaped the community's way of life. The mango grove planted by Arjun and Mira flourished, its trees growing tall and strong. It became known as Shahana's Grove, a sanctuary not only for elephants but also for other wildlife that ventured from the jungle. The villagers often gathered there, leaving offerings of fruit and grain for the animals as a gesture of respect and gratitude. Over time, the grove became a symbol of the harmony they had found with nature, a place where people could reflect on their connection to the world around them. Ravi, who had been too young to fully understand the events surrounding his rescue, grew up with stories of Shahana's heroism. His parents told him the tale often, each time weaving in new details about the elephant who had saved his life and the lessons she had taught the village. Ravi loved hearing the story, and as he grew older, he began sharing it with others, ensuring that Shahana's legacy would not be forgotten. One day, when Ravi was about 10 years old, he and his friends ventured into the grove. The boys ran among the trees, their laughter echoing through the air, while Ravi told them about the time Shahana had returned. "She stood right here," he said, pointing to a spot near the edge of the grove. "She looked at me, just like she knew who I was." His friends listened with wide eyes, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. "Do you think she'll come back again?" one of them asked. "She will," Ravi said with certainty. "Maybe not today, but she'll come back." The story of Shahana inspired more than just the children. The villagers began working with neighboring communities to create a larger protected area for the elephants and other wildlife. They planted more trees, expanded the buffer zones between the fields and the jungle, and established patrols to deter poachers. Over time, the region became a haven for elephants, attracting herds that had once been forced to roam dangerously close to human settlements. Despite these efforts, the bond between the village and the elephants remained rare and special. Shahana's herd, though occasionally seen at a distance, stayed mostly in the depths of the jungle. But every so often, the villagers would hear her trumpet, a low, resonant sound that echoed through the trees, reminding them that she was still there. One quiet morning, years after Shahana's first return, Ravi woke early and made his way to the grove. Now a young man of 16, he had taken on a leadership role in the village, helping to organize conservation efforts and teaching younger children about the importance of respecting nature. As he walked among the trees, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, he thought about Shahana and the many ways she had changed his life. Reaching the edge of the grove, Ravi paused. Something about the air felt different, a stillness that was both heavy and expectant. He scanned the jungle beyond the trees, his heart pounding as he caught sight of a familiar figure emerging from the shadows. It was Shahana. Her tusks were shorter now, worn by age, and her movements were slower, but her presence was as commanding as ever. Behind her, the rest of her herd followed, their numbers greater than before. Calves walked alongside their mothers, their small trunks waving inquisitively as they approached the grove. Ravi stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. He had imagined this moment so many times, but seeing Shahana again after all these years was overwhelming. Slowly, he stepped forward, his hands trembling at his sides. "Shahana," he whispered. The great elephant stopped, and turned her head toward him. Her dark eyes met his, and in that moment, it felt as though no time had passed. Ravi raised his hand, and Shahana extended her trunk, the two of them bridging the gap between their worlds once more. By now, other villagers had noticed the commotion and gathered at the grove. They watched in awe as Shahana and her herd moved gracefully among the trees, their presence both majestic and peaceful. Some of the older villagers wiped tears from their eyes, remembering the night Shahana had saved the village. The younger generation, who had grown up hearing stories of her heroism, whispered excitedly, marveling at the living legend before them. Arjun and Mira, now older but no less grateful, stood side by side, their hands intertwined. "She remembers us," Mira said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Of course she does," Arjun replied. "How could she forget?" Shahana lingered in the grove for hours, her herd grazing on the fruit trees, while the villagers watched from a respectful distance. It was as though she had come to visit an old friend, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. As the sun began to set, casting the grove in warm hues of orange and gold, Shahana lifted her trunk and let out a deep, resonant trumpet. It was a sound of farewell, but also of connection, a reminder that though their lives were different, they were forever intertwined. When the herd finally disappeared into the jungle, the villagers stood in silence, their hearts full. Ravi watched them go, his mind racing with thoughts of everything Shahana had taught him. He knew her visit wasn't just a moment to treasure. It was a call to action, a reminder of the responsibility they all shared to protect the land they called home. In the years that followed, Ravi became a leader not just in his village, but in the entire region. He worked tirelessly to expand the protected areas for wildlife, educating others about the importance of coexistence and conservation. Under his guidance, the villagers planted thousands of trees, restored damaged ecosystems, and created a sanctuary where elephants and humans could thrive together. Shahana's legacy endured, not just in the physical changes to the land, but in the hearts of the people she had touched. Her story was passed down through generations, a tale of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bond between humans and nature. And though she was seen less and less as the years went by, her presence was always felt, an eternal part of the jungle and the village she had helped save. One day, long after Shahana had last been seen, Ravi stood at the edge of the grove with his own children. He told them the story of the great elephant who had rescued him from the flood and taught an entire village the meaning of respect and coexistence. As he spoke, the jungle seemed to come alive with her memory. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of an elephant, and the soft breeze that carried her spirit through the trees. "She's still out there," Ravi said, smiling as he looked toward the jungle. "And as long as we remember her, she always will be